Hello, and welcome to the Multilingual World podcast. If, like me, you're fascinated by language and languages, you've probably asked yourself questions like, how multilingual is the world? Where are the world estimated 7,000 languages spoken? And which countries have the lion's share? How is this wealth of linguistic diversity managed by individuals, groups, and governmental authorities through language policies? And what are the consequences of such choices? Why do people stop speaking and transmitting their heritage languages and shift to dominant languages? What can we do to stop the 60 to 90% of the world's languages from disappearing? To explore these questions and many more, I will be interviewing influential academics and multilingual speakers living in Manchester to discuss aspects of multilingualism in different parts of the world, dispel the myths of inferior and primitive languages, and most importantly, we will discuss how language science contributes to improving access to better education and health, and how central it is to socioeconomic development and to fight social inequalities. I'm Dr. Serge Sanya. I'm a lecturer in linguistics at the University of Manchester, and I'm very excited to welcome you to the Multilingual World podcast. So welcome back to the Multilingual World podcast. Today I have a special guest, a former colleague of mine from the University of York. So we met at the University of York when I was doing a postdoc. And now he's in a different university. I'll let him introduce the university. So I'm really happy to have Professor Dominic Watt. So Professor Dominic Watt, I'll call you Dom, right?
Yes, please, yeah.
Yes, unless you call me Serge. We don't need to go into the doctor thing. So can you introduce yourself and can you introduce your university where you work now?
Absolutely.
Both changed, sorry. We both changed. I've moved to Manchester, University of Manchester, and you're in?
I'm at the University of Fechter, which is in the north of Germany, the northwest of Germany in Lower Saxony. Small town, university town, and I teach English linguistics there, forensic linguistics and English phonetics. And yeah, it's just a temporary contract, a 6-month contract, thanks to the German Academic Exchange Service, which has funded my stay.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so my background, well, as Serge mentioned, I was at the University of York for, well, quite a long time, actually, about 16 years, and 2 years before that with a break in between. So I have strong connections with the University of York, and one of the specialisms of York is forensic phonetics. It's world famous for that discipline, that subfield of linguistics, and it's a field that connects the world of law and law enforcement, policing, the world of the courts, to the world of linguistics for reasons that I hope I will be able to explain clearly to the audience of this podcast. It's a very fascinating, growing field, very popular with students. It's an attractive, a quote-unquote sexy subject at the moment. You'll see TV shows, Netflix series, and so on, which devote quite a large part or even a small part to the way that speech and language analysis can help to solve crimes.
Okay, that's exciting. Before we go into forensic linguistics, can you tell me what brought you to linguistics?
Well, I come from quite a linguistic-y family, actually. My parents were both English teachers, and they studied some linguistics themselves, as it happens, at university back in the 1960s. Like me, they studied at the University of Edinburgh, which is very well known internationally as a centre for linguistic study. And they were students, though they didn't know it at the time. I don't think they were students of some big names in the field. M.A.K. Halliday, for example, David Abercrombie. Those are names that I mentioned to them, and they said, "Oh yeah, that guy used to teach me."
I didn't know how big those guys were in
yeah, that's right. They for them, it wasn't their main subject. They were more interested in English literature, actually,
Okay.
which they went on to teach. But so I was surrounded as a child by, talk about language and books about language. And I used to love delving into encyclopedias. And one influence that I can recall is the Guinness Book of Records, believe it or not, which some of the editions that I had a section on interesting facts about language. Which language has the longest word? What's the longest place name in the world? How things are done in different languages. And it really captured my imagination. This was before I'd even studied French or Italian at school. Those are the languages that I studied at school. But it gave me a taste for language games, things like palindromes and anagrams and those sorts of things. Seeing language as a kind of a puzzle almost with a solution. And then when it was actually my father who said, have you considered studying linguistics at university? I didn't know what it was. And I thought, oh, well, I'll find out more. And I realized very quickly, yeah, this is the sort of thing I want to do. I found the possibility of doing more of these sorts of language puzzles and studying languages, further languages, Japanese, Arabic, Finnish. I thought this is just what I want to do. So that's the background to it.
Okay. So did you study phonetics straight away, or did you study a variety of subjects in linguistics before you specialize in forensic phonetics?
Yes, it was a general linguistics degree. Edinburgh then, as now, is a major centre for the study of phonetics.
Yeah.
Has a long tradition of doing that. And so that was available to me right from the very, very earliest days of my studies. And actually, people who taught me at the time, one of them went on to be my PhD supervisor, Jerry Docherty, who now works in Australia. And among many other names, Helen Fraser, who is now a very well-known forensic phonetician, forensic speech scientist in Australia, also Australia. Let's see who else. Many people who were influences at the time and have gone on to be colleagues. Jo Verhoeven, for example, at City University. I've just been working with him, teaching forensic phonetics at City University. Okay. So yeah, quite a long list, long-standing relationships with other people in the field.
Yeah. So one thing you have mentioned a few times is science, so linguistics with science. Often when I talk to people who are not used to linguistics, who are not familiar with the discipline of linguistics, they often ask me if linguistics is a science, or whether we do translation, or how many languages do we speak. That's the classic. Wherever you ask, someone asks you, what do you do? And you tell them, I'm a linguist, I do linguistics, or I teach linguistics. They ask you also, how many languages do you speak? Why is linguistics a science if it's a science?
Well, I would normally say linguistics is the science of language. That's an easy way of just defining it in a few words. It falls on a spectrum, really. I mean, you've mentioned there, Serge, some of the different aspects of what being a linguist might involve. Everything from interpreting, for example, right through to really kind of hardcore science, where you're looking at what's going on inside people's brains as they process language. They're listening to different sorts of stimuli over headphones, and you can see which parts of the brain light up. People study the anatomy of speech, the physiology of speech. You can hook people up to different devices and measure what their body's doing, the kind of airflow, the acoustics of speech, studying speech as a form of sound, which it is, of course, the way that the ear responds to speech as we hear it coming in through the air. There's lots of
perception.
Yeah,
so the perception part, how you perceive the sounds.
Exactly, all that kind of thing. So in phonetics, that falls towards the very sciencey end of linguistics, I suppose, in that we look at anatomy and physiology, the way that the human body can produce speech sounds. So that's speech production, we call that. And then we have the propagation of well, it's vibrations of air molecules. Really, that's what sound is, and we take advantage of the way that we can make sound change by moving our speech organs around.
Yeah.
That's the second P. I'm going to talk in terms of the three Ps. So speech production, propagation through the air, and then perception by the ear and the brain. Another way you can think about that is the three A's. So articulation of speech, moving speech organs around to modify the flow of air through your head and neck. Then acoustics, the study of sound, and audition, which is the study of hearing. So we look at those, we conceive of speech as being stages or links in a chain, really, the speech chain, where the speaker does something, the environment responds, the air vibrates in a particular way, and then the listener intercepts the signal and can make sense of it. They can realize, aha, the cat is sitting on the mat or something, whatever the message happens to be.
Yeah. So this is fascinating, and it leads us to our next point, forensic phonetics. So what is it? What is forensic phonetics? What is forensic linguistics? And what do forensic linguists do?
Okay, well, there's a lot to cover there, Serge. I'll do my best. So phonetics, as I've mentioned, is the study of speech production and perception. And forensic phonetics is the application of that branch of the speech sciences to the courts, to the world of law, to assisting with police investigations, intelligence gathering, those sorts of areas, helping to solve crime and catch the bad guys, I suppose, in the end. And the reason we do this is because there's a massive amount of recorded material out there, increasing amounts of speech recordings out there, because these days, of course, we all carry in our pockets a very sophisticated sound recording device in the form of a smartphone. Lots of telephone calls, for example, are recorded routinely, ones that you would make to a bank or an insurance company, for example. Those are recorded routinely in the same way that police interviews are now, at least in the UK. You're obliged to record those, make a recording of those.
Without you knowing you can be recorded. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, not so much in the UK, but certainly in other countries, many police forces make use of intercept recording. So that's phone tapping, bugging people's cars and workplaces and so on, their homes, in order to gather material that might be of evidence in a trial, for example, or intelligence gathering, monitoring individuals or groups who are under suspicion for wrongdoing in some way, drugs, gangs, that kind of thing.
So they record, their voices are recorded.
Their voices are recorded. There's a lot of incidental material recorded as well, and often the technical quality of the recordings is dreadful.
Oh yeah.
Because if people don't know they're being recorded,
yes,
they might have a TV on, they could be driving in a car, there's lots of engine noise, road noise, music, background noise, other people's voices. It might be in quite a public place, like a restaurant, for example. We all know of those TV documentaries where a journalist will go in and try and get an incriminating recording from some person who's alleged to be a criminal. So very often the technical quality of the material is very, very poor. You have to apply some enhancement techniques, clean up the recordings, get rid of the background noise, other voices that aren't relevant. There's a lot of work that sometimes has to be done just to get recordings in shape to be listened to and then analyzed using the technology that we have for voice comparison. The other thing
the cleaning. Yeah, go ahead. The other thing.
Well, you asked about what's the difference between forensic phonetics and forensic linguistics, and you could say that forensic phonetics is part of forensic linguistics. It's under the same umbrella. It's about analyzing language for forensic purposes to do with the courts and law enforcement and so on. But in forensic linguistics, the emphasis is usually on written texts. So it might be something like an incriminating email,
Okay.
a ransom demand note, a threatening letter. It could even be things as they don't have anything to do with crime. They're much more benign, if you will. Things like trademark disputes. Sometimes a linguist is asked, can you help us to resolve this seemingly unresolvable stalemate between, two companies that are at loggerheads with each other about a trademark that one of them wants to register. Those sorts of things. It's a very broad spectrum of different activities. The main one that people know about, I suppose the most interesting one for the general public, is to do with the crime angle, and those are the ones that Netflix makes the documentaries about. Who is this mystery man who is writing nasty letters to a newspaper, or who is the culprit behind this blackmail demand, or those sorts of more intriguing and mysterious aspects.
I'm tempted to ask you how they analyze the text, what aspect they analyze, but we're going to talk about forensic phonetics, but I'm still tempted. Do they look at the syntax or the style? What aspect of the word order to make it more, plain for the
Right,
non-linguist?
yeah. Well, both of those things. Yeah,
Okay.
so you can look at the grammar, you can look at the word choices, the vocabulary used. You can apply various sorts of stylistic techniques which involve measuring things, actually quantifying the frequencies of words, or
Statistical techniques.
exactly, yes, you can come up with a kind of a mathematical characterization almost of the text, and look at word frequencies, the frequencies of different sorts of grammatical choices, even things like punctuation, how people format the date at the top if it's a letter. There's lots of different ways you can do that. Might there be some kind of relevance or usefulness to
all the patterns of choices that the writer makes, basically, are analyzed.
You've hit the nail on the head there, Serge, actually, by using the phrase, the word choice, because there's lots of different ways you can get a message across in language. Of course, even just within one language, there's lots of different ways of formulating the same idea. And the choices that we make can help to identify us as individual language users, or at least to help narrow down the kind of person that you might be. If you can imagine let's say a kidnap ransom note, you don't know who wrote it, but is there anything in the language used that you can actually try to narrow down who the suspect, the perpetrator, might be? Is that person a native speaker of the language in question? What kind of background, educational, geographical background might that person have? And use the clues embedded in the text to move things along and help to resolve the situation.
Wow. Okay. So before we get into, I'm basically building up towards the forensic and the discussion on forensic phonetics. Before we get there, there's one thing I wanted to discuss: accents. I know you've worked on accent bias. Is it part of your work on forensic phonetics? Is it part of your research?
It certainly is, yes.
So can you explain to like a non-linguist what accent bias is, and what, like, maybe about the accents in the UK, if you have something to show, maybe you can show it, but yeah.
Sure thing. Okay. Well, let's take things back to first principles. Forensic phonetics is a form of what I would call applied sociolinguistics. What does that mean? Well, people study language variation, language change, and we can say interesting things about that without having to then use it for anything, to apply it to anything. But it's really useful if you work in forensic linguistics and you're trying to apply your work to the world of law enforcement, criminal investigation, intelligence gathering, those sorts of things. it's really useful to know what language is like in the here and now, on the ground. Okay, what do real people do when they speak, when they write?
Mm-hmm.
What is the situation on this very date in 2023?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you need up-to-date information about the way that language varies, even on a very kind of localized scale sometimes. You know, two adjacent towns, what makes people sound different from those places, that can be of relevance. Now, accent bias comes in several ways here, really. The most sort of basic definition, I suppose, is preferences that people have for one accent versus another. And on the face of it, you know, there's no real harm in that. It's just you know, what kind of music do you like? I like this kind. My friend likes another kind. You know, nobody gets hurt as a result of that. There's no problem with it. The problem might come, however, when that bias leads you to feel more prejudiced towards speakers of a different accent. You might think, well, I don't like the sound of that accent. That leads me to think there's something wrong with that person. You know, they're not as intelligent, for example, as that other person over there who speaks in a more educated way, let's say, or has a particularly nice way of speaking. So we're starting here to go from just, you know, purely subjective preference over into the sorts of a kind of imbalance that might lead people to act in a discriminatory way towards someone else. And if you're in a position of power, let's say you're an employer, and you think, I don't like the way this person talks, I'm going to appoint the other person who came for interview. Well, potentially there's a bit of unfairness there, because it may be that there is no difference in terms of the competence of the two candidates. The only difference between them is the way that they speak. They would be just as good at the job.
Yeah.
But their, you know, a bias of preference has led to concrete, you know, actual discrimination, which affects people's lives.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's a problem, and it can lead to problems with, or claims of discrimination in the workplace, and that's where we come into the world again of law and lawyers and employment law, those sorts of areas.
Okay.
There's other ways in which it can affect the way that I suppose justice is done in the forensic context, in the context of the courts, whereby, let's say, if people are sitting on a jury, they may be more inclined to think that a speaker who has this kind of accent is more likely to be guilty than somebody who speaks in a different way. And there has been some experimental work done to investigate that issue.
So someone who speaks, sorry to interrupt, I was just going to ask, if someone who speaks with what we call RP or standard English would be more believable than someone who speaks a regional variety or social variety?
That's the finding, actually, yes. Now, it depends on what kind of crime has been alleged. You have, well, some of the work has looked at differences between so-called white-collar crime, that's like financial fraud, versus blue-collar crime, which could be something like just simple theft. And they've related the way that the speaker sounds and looks. Actually, they've incorporated ethnic characteristics, for example, in some of the experiments, and they've looked at how those factors interact. And it seems that certain kinds of accents, one of the accents that was tested in an experiment done in Birmingham was the urban Birmingham accent, Brummie, so-called. And they found that the listeners, these just ordinary people who could easily be called for jury service in a real case in this simulation, they said that they thought that the speaker with a Birmingham accent was more likely to be guilty, especially of a blue-collar crime like theft, than somebody who spoke with a standard British accent received pronunciation. So that's an example of where accent bias can lead to quite serious forms of discrimination too.
Is there a hierarchy between the different accents then in the UK?
Definitely, yes. And it's quite an old one. It goes back generations, many
Can you
decades.
tell us a bit about it? Because, I guess I know the Mancunian accent because I, lived there for a while. I can recognize, Liverpudlian, maybe Scottish a bit, but you can tell me more.
Okay,
So for someone who never heard, who doesn't really know the UK.
right. Okay, well, top of the pile,
Yeah,
generally speaking, is what's known as BBC English,
yeah,
received pronunciation, Queen's English, King's English now.
yeah.
That is the accent that is rated highest for prestige, certainly, and
Mhm.
very often for attractiveness as
Yeah,
well. That's considered the kind of pinnacle of the accent.
posh
Yeah,
accent.
posh is another name for it. Yeah, so somebody who's perhaps been through a exclusive school, perhaps a fee-paying school,
Mhm.
and then possibly one of the more prestigious universities.
Yeah.
It's the accent that most people will tend to think of when they think of British English.
Mm.
So, the members of the current British government, Rishi Sunak, for example, the Prime Minister, has
Yeah,
that kind of accent. And then below those, you have other accents which are considered, they're associated with a high level of education, standardness, competence, general intelligence, those sorts of things. And I'm pleased to say I'm speaking with one of them now, Standard Scottish English, which is, it strikes a nice balance, I would say, between perceived prestige, intelligence, and competence, and industriousness, and all those traits, and on the other hand, friendliness, warmth, generosity, sense of humor, those kinds of traits on the other hand. So we have, on the one hand, what we call competence traits. So that's the ones that would relate to how competent, how intelligent, how educated people think you are. And then so-called solidarity traits, which are to do with the more kind of human side of a person's character.
yeah,
Do they seem warm, friendly, trustworthy? Do they have a sense of humor? Could you relate to them?
yeah,
So received pronunciation at the top of the pile
yeah.
tends to be, it's rated high for education and intelligence, but
Intelligence.
maybe not so much for the warmth and friendliness. It can sometimes be perceived as rather a cold or distant or aloof sort of accent.
Mm.
Further down, then, we start to lose the sense of prestige, but we do find that scores, ratings for friendliness, warmth, sense of humor, trustworthiness, those start to rise again. So, for example, if you're from Newcastle upon Tyne, you might have a Geordie accent up there in the northeast of England, and that people have a very positive impression, a very positive stereotype of people with that accent. But the trouble is that although you might be seen as funny and friendly and trustworthy, all those good things, it's not rated high for competence.
Mm.
So that you can imagine that might have an impact in, say, a professional environment. You might have lots and lots of qualifications.
Yeah,
You might have a degree in law or something like that. But if your accent doesn't quite fit with that image,
yeah,
it could disadvantage you.
yeah.
Right down at the bottom of the pile, I'm sorry to say, Birmingham always comes last in
Really?
these polls. Yeah, for one
So,
reason or
so
another.
Birmingham versus Liverpool, is Birmingham under Liverpool in terms of
Those two accents are in close competition for being at the bottom of the pile.
oh,
Yeah, Liverpool similarly. On the one hand, okay, let's try to put a more positive spin on this. On the one hand, Liverpool English is associated with music, the Beatles, of course,
okay.
in particular.
Yeah,
Also comedy. There's lots and lots of British comedians who come from Liverpool. It's a
okay.
really long list, actually. So on the one hand, you've got those sorts of positive associations, very creative people, people who can use language for artistic purposes, to make people laugh, all those really nice positive things that we associate with Liverpool.
Yeah.
But the city has an association also with crime
Okay.
and general kind of, social problems, unemployment, those sorts of things. It's got a long history of
Yeah.
being associated with different sorts of, social ills, shall we call them.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a trade-off there. The fact is, though, because Liverpool English is very distinctive sounding, it's been influenced by Irish English in the past, and it's
Okay.
got this very distinctive, unique sound that, I really like the sound of it personally.
I do too. I like it.
Yeah.
I use videos from Liverpool, a Liverpudlian accent actually to in my classes, just to tell people that it's just normal. Variation is normal. It's normal to speak differently.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But to many people's ears, they can't get past this association with the things that they don't like, a post-industrial city with these social problems. They think, well, that means that anybody who speaks that way must be
Yeah.
predisposed to antisocial behavior, to criminality, those sorts of things. It's all wrong, of course,
Yeah.
but that's the stereotype, and that's how these associations work.
Wow. And of course, as you said earlier, that can also play up in court.
Well, of course, absolutely, yes. I mean, trials by jury in the UK, we think of that as being a very valuable contribution that ordinary people can make to the delivery of justice.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you bring in people from a diversity of backgrounds with no legal training, sometimes they can be more influenced
Yeah.
than others
Yeah.
by professional legal people,
Yeah.
by ideas, preconceptions that they bring with them. Now you might say, oh well, it's fine because the legal professionals they can rise above those sorts of
The human beings.
popular ideas, yeah, but actually they're just as susceptible as everybody else is.
Yeah.
This is the thing with accent bias. It's unconscious largely, and
Yeah.
it's really difficult to overcome those knee-jerk reactions, those immediate responses that we have to something that we like or we don't like.
Mm.
And if you hear an accent that you grew up disliking,
Yes.
in a witness in the courtroom or a defendant, somebody who's been accused of a crime, and if you happen to associate that accent with criminality, well, there's a very strong chance that you might be, your view might be biased or skewed towards thinking that the person has done something wrong.
Yeah.
And clearly, there's an unfairness built
Yeah.
into that.
And that's where forensic phonetics comes in actually to help in situations like that.
I think it can, because if we do systematic research on these issues, we can hand them over to the legal community and say, look, we've done some very balanced, unbiased, impartial research on this. We've tried to be as objective as we possibly can.
Yeah.
And although in an ideal world, there wouldn't be these sorts of biases almost baked into the system, you should be aware that they exist. And if we can't do anything, if we can't achieve anything else in this way, one thing that we can do is raise people's awareness that there could be a problem, that could be an issue.
Yeah.
And that's half the battle, It's just saying to people, you might think you're the most fair-minded individual in the world, but everybody has these sorts of biases and preconceptions.
Yeah.
I'll hold up my hands myself and say, I've been studying accent for more than 30 years now, and I still have these instinctive or
Reactions.
immediate reactions to the way that other people speak. It's just
Have
as
the
true.
knowledge to look past them.
Exactly. Yes. So you can say to yourself, well, actually, I know that it's wrong, it's unfair to react that way, and I can list the reasons why I think that and why, objectively speaking, there's, if you have multiple choices in terms of pronunciation of a word in English, there's no sense in which one of those is intrinsically better than another. You know, if you think about the name for one example I always use is the name for a bread roll. Okay, there's lots of different words for that in British English, but one of them might be standard, but that doesn't mean it's a better name for the word or a more. Doesn't mean it's a more. There's more roll likeness to it.
Doesn't make the bread roll tastier.
No, exactly. Yeah. It's quite arbitrary, really. It's just that one has been put in the dictionary. One is taught to foreign learners of English. You know, this is the correct word for that. And so there's this conflation, this rolling together, no pun intended, of standardness with correctness. People think that if it's standard, it must be correct.
Yeah.
And vice versa. But one thing that we can do as linguists is to say, well, let's try and let's critically analyze that relationship between correctness and standardness. And they can be teased apart. You just have to do some awareness raising, as I say, and just say, look, that's not an automatic relationship between standardness and correctness. There's different ways of doing it, and you know, they're all equally valid, arguably.
Yeah. So how do you do your, work? Like, how do you do your research? How do you make your, let's say, contribution, to a court case or to a, criminal investigation more objective than, let's say, a member of a jury who is, who's not analyzing the actual sounds, whose collection you told us about right earlier, right? How do you make that like an objective? How can you come up and say, my contribution, I believe, is more objective, is replicable, let's say, is more replicable than others?
Okay. Yeah, well, we have a fairly large set of different techniques and tools at our disposal. One thing is, okay, so let's break this down. We have, in the UK anyway, the norm when you're doing this kind of work is to use what's called the acoustic phonetic method, which involves careful listening to recordings on a loop. You can do it many dozens of times, and we transcribe the material we can hear, both in just regular spelling, but also using the symbols of the International Phonetic Alphabet, and that allows you to capture fine-grained details of the way that the words were pronounced. So that's one approach. We can also then apply acoustic analysis, where we use computers to break the recording down into its component parts. Just as we do with other forms of sound, you can express the sound in terms of factors such as frequency, the duration of different sounds, vowels and consonants, for example, and then also the acoustic intensity, how loud some parts of the signal are relative to others. Frequency, it can be quite complex, actually. It can be the pitch of the voice, for example. We can measure that using different techniques. One commonly used unit is the Hertz unit, so that just talks about the number of repetitions per second of something that repeats in the speech signal, the pitch of your voice, for example. That can tell you something about what the vocal folds inside your larynx are doing. We can measure the resonances produced by the vocal tract in vowel sounds, for example, and what that tells you is something about the degree to which somebody's speech organs might actually be unique to that person, and that can help us narrow down. Let's say if you have two recordings to compare with one another, and there's a strong resemblance in terms of those resonances and the pitch of the voice and the pronunciations of the vowels and the consonants, well, then you can start to build a picture of the relative probability that the two speech samples were produced by the same talker versus two different people. The third strand that we have available to us is the use of automatic methods, so automatic speaker recognition software. As the name suggests, you put your recordings in, the computer does some mathematical wizardry, and at the end it says, I can give you a score which reflects the similarity of the voices in those two recordings. It gives you a number. Now, on its own, the number doesn't mean very much. It just says, you know, they are 70% similar. What does that mean? You might think, well, that's quite similar, but it's not very, very similar. What would happen if I was just to take 2 recordings at random from the population? Would I find that level of similarity, or would it be a much smaller number? And so what you have to do is you kind of, it's like you're triangulating almost. You've got your score for the 2 recordings in your investigation. And then you're saying, speaking relative to the background population, so just 2 random English speakers, you can say, actually, that number of 70% turns out to be pretty high. And it wouldn't be that common, actually, for you to find that level of similarity just choosing at random.
If you
so
choose,
what we're doing effectively is saying, we've got a number that you can use to talk about similarity, but then another number that you can use to say how typical is that number, and you relate the 2 numbers together. You can do this formally using a mathematical ratio, and that gives you a number at the end, which it captures quite a lot about the characteristics of the recordings themselves, but also the assumptions that you make when you're doing the analysis. Did these come from 2 different speakers, or were they both produced by the same person? You relate those 2 numbers together and you come up with a conclusion. You can then present all of this to the court or to the police initially and say, this is what I think. What you can't do, it's very important to stress this actually, what we can't do is say, I think it was the guy you arrested. I think you got the right guy. We're not allowed to say anything like that.
You're not allowed, you don't say that.
No. That's a decision that the court has to make. All right. So what we're doing is we're helping them to make that decision. We're giving them some more evidence that they can use to decide on the guilt or the innocence of the accused person. So that's our role. We might be called into the court to give expert evidence. We will give a general statement of our position on the matter, and then we'll be subjected to cross-examination, where the idea is that the cross-examining counsel, the barrister, will try and tear our opinion apart and really, dissect it and say, well, you said this on page 14, and do you think that is right? And you have to then defend what you've said. And that's the role of the expert witness, somebody who has knowledge and expertise that goes beyond what an ordinary person could be expected to have.
So do you sometimes have to physically go to court?
Sometimes.
Defend your analysis?
Occasionally. It's quite rare to have to do that. Actually, in many cases, the court will accept your report, or they'll just say, we don't want to use this after all. In rare cases, they'll say, we want you to come on this date and talk us through what you found. There's a pretty good chance also you might be grilled for a while on it. But it's fairly uncommon, actually. The courts don't make a huge amount of use of expert witnesses in person. And these days, actually, when they do want to do that, they are happy to do it remotely, over Zoom or some other link. So the chance to travel the world, if you're working on international cases, those chances are now less frequent than they were.
Well, hopefully they don't put you face to face with the defendant, and then you get identified as the person who identified the voice.
Yeah, well, that does happen, of course. And you put your name and address are already on the report. So even if you don't get called to the trial, this a dangerous gangster, let's say, might say, well, we don't like this guy. He's saying things about us that could land us in prison. And but I haven't heard of witness intimidation on any scale before. I don't know why that is. You would expect it to happen occasionally, but yeah. Luckily for the likes of me, because I wouldn't want to invite that sort of attention.
Doing linguistics can be dangerous, it seems.
Yeah, well, in this case, it can be. But I suppose
But it's
it's
more helpful than dangerous, I think. This is actually quite, it's something nice for non-linguists to hear, at least, the rigorous scientific methods used, to help like one area, at least of a society, let's say.
I agree, and at the moment, I mean, in the past, it was the case that you didn't have to be particularly qualified to do this work.
Okay.
And obviously there's a risk there that the expert gets the answer wrong and there's miscarriages of justice and people end up getting wrongly convicted and all those sorts of serious risks. But what's good is that in more recent years, everything's been tightened up. So in order to practice in this area, you need to, these days, realistically, you need to have a PhD in the subject or something very closely related to it.
Yeah.
You need to ideally have had some specialized training to do the work. The police these days, they really do want people who are the most qualified, the most experienced that they can get hold of.
Yeah.
Lots of people want to come into the field. There are training courses, including in York, as I mentioned earlier on. This MSc in Forensic Speech Science has been going now since 2007, and it's trained up many of the people who are now practitioners across the world. We've had quite a big influence in terms of the changes that have come about in the field, thanks to the rigor of the training that we provide.
You provide, yeah.
So that's changing. The government in the UK has decided that there has to be a much stricter way of licensing practitioners to ensuring that the laboratories that they work in are set up in a particular way. There's double checking done at every stage, all sorts of checks and cross checks about potential contamination of sound recordings by magnets and all sorts of very scrupulous checks and balances to make sure that the risks are minimized. So you vet the people who do the work, of course, very carefully, especially as quite often there's a security implication as well, national security. People need to be checked that they're going to keep things secret,
of course, yeah.
not share materials, that kind of thing. But also the general working practices, the equipment that you use, the premises that you work in, all those things, it's being very, very sharply, tightly scrutinized these days. And that's got to be a good thing, I think, because we don't want to end up pinning the blame on the wrong people.
Yeah, exactly.
And in some countries where the death penalty still applies, there really is, there's an even higher risk of making mistakes. So, yeah.
I mean, I remember listening to a BBC podcast in which, John Ball, who does research on linguistic profiling in the United States.
I do indeed, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was saying that there was a case where someone was accused of committing a crime, and he was, I think he was sentenced to death. And his cousin called him, at least he was already arrested, and his cousin called him in and said to him, "Why don't you ask for a speedy trial?" And so he answered to his cousin, and the transcription wrote, "Why would I ask for a speedy trial when I committed a crime?" So obviously the jury would, say that this is evidence, it came from his mouth. But then his team analyzed the production, right, the recording. And what they found out is that he was saying, "Why would I ask for a speedy trial when I ain't committed a crime?" So there's a difference, is really a nasal vowel. When I ain't committed a crime. And the people who actually probably not fluent in his local variety wrote when I committed the crime, and that's the difference between, it can be the difference at least between death penalty. Yeah,
That's a fantastic example.
yeah,
And obviously the potential for tragic mistakes is huge here. There's lots of examples of like much the same as that in the case literature, where words like can and can't have been confused with each other, and they mean polar opposites to each other.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So this sub area, what we call disputed utterance analysis, where one side is saying, I think he said can, the other side is saying, no, he's saying can't.
Oh Lord.
You can imagine in cases like that, it really is absolutely vital that
Yes, to get it
somebody
right.
with expertise steps in to try and resolve that dispute and say, there are reasons for thinking that the utterance is this rather than that. Here they are. If I need to explain them to lay people over the course of 3 or 4 days, then so be it, because what are the consequences of getting this wrong? It could go very badly wrong for the accused person.
Yeah.
So that particular example is a perfect example where it just isn't clear what somebody said, and yet on the one hand it might sound like a confession, on the other it would be sufficient to exonerate the person of guilt.
Yeah.
So this is where forensic phonetics can really show its worth. That's a particularly stark example, but there are others that I could name which are equally on a knife edge.
Wow. So that means that you have to not only know, the tools you're using, but you also have to know the different regional accents very well. I mean, or study them at least very carefully. You also need to know, like, let's say, I'm trying to avoid saying sociolect, but the way, let's say, given a group of people in society speak, it could be like young people. So you have to understand, like, even slang, that all that is important.
It's all important, absolutely. It's not just the vowels and the consonants and the intonation and things like that we need to take into account. It's also the choice of words that people use. Sometimes in the case of disputed utterances, it's really hard to work out what somebody said because you're not familiar with the slang term that was used.
Yeah.
And slang changes really rapidly.
Yeah.
It changes all the time. It varies even on very, very small scales.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of that. A colleague at Aston University in Birmingham, a guy called Tim Grant, very experienced forensic linguist, he got involved in a case where there was a dispute over the meaning of the word plague as a slang term.
Yeah.
And it turned out that there were two adjacent tower blocks on a housing estate where the young people there were using plague to mean entirely different things.
Wow.
In one case, it meant something really good. In the other case, it meant something really bad. And they were only a few meters apart, these buildings. So, we're talking about that level of resolution and precision. It can't always be achieved. We have useful sources like online slang dictionaries, Urban Dictionary, for example. Okay, I mean, the level of editorial control over Urban Dictionary is not what you would want from a print dictionary.
Yeah.
But it's updated every day. So
right. Oh, every day. Okay, I was going to ask, how often is it updated?
Well, some very popular terms, there's a lot of people who are wannabe lexicographers and, just lay people with an interest in language, or they just want to be the latest person to say, to some jokey definition, let's say. But they'll go on and it's constantly being updated, whereas the more reputable slang dictionaries, like the one that Jonathan Green produces, there's a print version of that, but there's also an online version. With the best will in the world, he can't update that on anything like such a regular basis.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just have to go back to the members of a community themselves and say, look, I can hear this word in the recording, but I'm not sure what it means.
Yeah.
What's the person saying?
Yeah.
It sounds like this, and I've been able to transcribe some of the sounds.
Yeah.
You know, on the screen, on the computer screen, I can see that it looks like this. It must have this kind of vowel in it, for example. But
Yeah.
it's gobbledygook. What do you reckon?
Yeah.
And sometimes local people say, "Oh, well, he's obviously saying this," and that can help plug the gap. You know,
Back
resolve
to the field.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no greater experts on how a language works than native speakers
The
themselves.
native speakers, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so is there anything that you wanted to add to our conversation? You're the specialist. Something
Well,
that people you would like our audience to know or to hear.
what I would say is this sounds like a very extremely niche and specialist field that only a few people will ever be able to work in.
Yeah.
But I think it's fair to say that the amount of work available is expanding. And if anybody watching this thinks, you know what, I would like to find out more about this.
Yeah.
There are more and more training opportunities available in the form of master's degrees at different universities. I mentioned York. Aston has a very well-known master's program in forensic linguistics. That's more based on text analysis, but they do some speech analysis work as well. You can go to the Netherlands. There's places here in Germany you can study the subject. It's a bit of a growth field, a growth area. Yeah. And so I wouldn't want people to feel put off that you need to spend, a decade studying this before you'll even be allowed to practice. There are routes into this that are a little bit more forgiving. The other thing I would say, though, I would really stress is that we don't have all the answers. And actually, there are many things that we would like to be able to do that we're not capable of doing yet. So some of the things that you see in the movies and dramatic representations of the way that forensic scientists go about their work, just be really careful about, taking those at face value.
Yeah.
There is a well-known effect in our field called the CSI effect, named after the popular TV crime show CSI. They portrayed the work that forensic scientists do in a very unrealistic way because the time scales were always really short. You'd get a sound recording, a speech recording. Yeah. They would feed it into their amazing laptop that can do work miracles, press a button, and they say, "Oh yeah, right, there's our suspect right there. 99% chance certain." It's not like that, really.
That's not real life.
No, it's not real life, sadly. But that's what we're aspiring towards in the future. If we could do that, life would be wonderful.
Fantastic. It's a fascinating area of research. I'm even tempted to learn a bit, but I have my own things to do for now.
Yeah. Well, if you ever find the time, Serge, you'd be very welcome to join the community. You have.
All right. Okay. Well, I might not need a second invitation.
Well, you're an amazing polyglot, so you have expertise in all sorts of areas. So, yeah, you could be a very useful addition to our field.
No, we'll see. Okay, thank you very much, Dom, for coming to the Multilingual World podcast. I suppose we've spoken about multi-dialectal, world within in the UK. We could have spoken about, even foreign accent. I was going to mention foreign accent, but I haven't. What role they play within this whole, world, let's say, of accent bias. Maybe that's for another conversation.
Well, I'd be happy to come back and give my thoughts on that if you want.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, and I'll see you very soon.
Okay.
Hopefully. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
Okay. Before we go, remember that there is no education without language. There is no socioeconomic development without language. There is no meaningful political stability without good language management. Remember also that children and adults can function perfectly with multiple languages. So be a proud multilingual. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on our social media platforms, and see you very soon for another episode on the Multilingual World podcast.